This is a report by McKinsey, where in the last few years, you've probably noticed the increased Chinese presence in the country, setting up enterprises in the country. A McKinsey and Company report reveals that these Chinese-run enterprises have created employment for 127,000 Kenyans, mostly in the manufacturing industry. Now, here's a breakdown of what the report says. Of course, we begin with just a general overview, and this is looking at what are some of the research, what are some of the countries that McKinsey and Company conducted this research. That includes Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. Of course, it looked at 8 economies, making up 2/3 of the total trade for the sub-Saharan countries. That's just a general overview of the report. And then, of course, they interviewed 1,000 African and Chinese companies and spoke to 100 African business leaders. And just looking at the diversity of services, of course, you look at Chinese companies mainly in the infrastructural sector. And what are some of the findings? You're looking at the first, of course, the 127,000 employees of these Chinese companies are Kenyans. This is particularly just narrowing down on the country. 396 Chinese companies are also operating in the country, looking at 89% hiring of local talent. But the concern there was that mainly on the kind of the lower cadre jobs as opposed to managerial jobs. And looking at the findings across Africa now, moving away from Kenya, you're looking at the 20% annual growth rate, and there's an FDI projection of 40%. And then there's 50% market share of all infrastructure sector. That's now looking at a diversity of areas, just now including engineering, procurement, and construction. That's where the 50% is going. And then the 20% is just looking at the profit margins created by the Chinese investments in Africa. Now, for you to note there, the 50 expectations of growth levels from 180 billion to 440 billion by 2025. Now, just to bring that home, that basically means that, looking at 7 times the country's GDP is what the Chinese companies are projecting the investments in Africa will bring them. That's by the year 2025. And just a quick note, well, what comes out of it is just local versus managerial hiring. So we have 90% locals, yes, are hired, but again, we only have 40% represented in managerial positions. The second there is how or where do they actually source for materials? We only find that 40% of their materials are locally sourced. There's now, of course, an increase in skills and knowledge transfer. And a key challenge that they mentioned there is on corruption. And that's across Africa, of course, looking at the 3 economies and other sub-Saharan African countries. And, of course, there is a barrier, kind of a language barrier, of course, cultural barrier between the Chinese companies and Kenyan companies. Lastly, so what? Of course, they have launched a report. This is an Africa-wide report. What next from here? Of course, they're looking at recommendations for Africa. Just kind of Africa should have its own strategy for doing business with China. Where exactly with that head, of course, this includes, take for instance, Vision 2030 for Kenya, Vision 2025 for Tanzania, how the 2 countries can merge, and also looking at Chinese government financing. Now, most of the Chinese companies in Africa, 90% are privately owned, so maybe an inclusive, more of the government-led initiatives with the Chinese governments. And of course, responsible business practice. This just includes the corruption bit, and of course that language barrier initiative. And last but not least, agriculture is a priority sector. Now you realize most of them are particularly on the infrastructural side, and of course the report notes that agriculture should be mentioned as one of the priority sectors for that.